Namaste. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our continuing series, Evenings with Sraddhalu. Last time we went through some very interesting exercises for the purification and the training of the intelligence. Today we will explore the next step of the liberation of our consciousness. Our session is entitled The Liberation of the Spirit, and I welcome Sraddhalu to introduce and lecture us. Thank you. Namaste.
Thank you and namaste. Happy to be with all of you. We have been going through a pretty intensive study of the structure and form of the integral yoga with a special emphasis on the practice. And each time I feel Sri Aurobindo's presentation is so detailed, so in-depth, so richly woven that I don't do sufficient justice in presenting only an aspect that is more applied for the practice. And so I will always encourage all of you to read these chapters on your own after we have had this session and then reread them a second time. The reason being, once you have this larger framework, when you read the text, a lot of things which earlier you might have lost reference or context because of the very rich and detailed presentation will stand out, and the structure and the flow will be clear, as well as the aspect of application. And then when you read a second time, it's as if the earlier reading has prepared you, and now you are able to understand in even greater depth. So this is my suggestion to all of you. You will recall the last 4 sessions in particular, we have been in some depth in the deeper psychology that Sri Aurobindo presents, which founds itself on the oneness of spirit, of Satchidananda, which is our truth, our true existence, our true state of oneness, completeness, blissfulness, as also the origin of the whole universe. How from there we ended up with this kind of a very mixed, confused little piece is what becomes clearer as we go along, and particularly in the discussion today. But what is to be recognized is, in understanding how this happened, we also discover the means by which we can recover our poise and life in the Satchidananda while engaging fully with the fullness of reality, including the reality of the material world and our physical body. Not only we are able to experience these from that poise, but most important, we are able to bring that consciousness all the way down into the most material parts for a full action on all the planes, including the most physical, through the most physical consciousness, which offers a unique experience which does not exist in any other domain of reality, which is the unique experience of many different forms, each individual, and the play among them, which is also an expression of the Satchidananda. Each individual being entirely one with the divine and yet representing and expressing a unique aspect. The whole play among us being also an expression of the delight of the divine and yet representing a certain aspect. And the totality of the universe becoming gradually, over time, in its evolutionary awakening, a revelation of the divine Ananda in the play of objectivized forms. This is the broad sense of the direction, and you will see the fulfillment also of the integral yoga in the 7-fold scheme that Sri Aurobindo lays out. We have, in the last few sessions, also gone through some depth of the levels of consciousness within us, all the way to the buddhi, the intelligence, and the will, which is the link point to the higher possibilities and the diviner intuitive and Gnostic consciousness, and the purification necessary to separate these layers and to allow each to function for the role that it is intended, and gradually make each a vehicle for the aspect that it represents of the divine consciousness, so that this, which is now a crude approximation, reflection of a diviner possibility, becomes gradually in the image of the divine, and the powers that they represent now reveal themselves more and more directly, which is the nature of the transformation, a fundamental change in the very working, in the very texture and substance, that which is now represented indirectly, even falsely though, because distorted, becomes now a vehicle for the full, pure, clear transmission, streaming of the divine life above, belonging to the oneness, now playing out as a oneness in a multiplicity here. This is the broad direction that we had been building towards, ending with the importance of the buddhi as our center and the focal point from which we work to open to the higher consciousness. It acts as a link, as we saw. The Chatushtaya, the quartet that describes this process which we are studying, is the Siddhi Chatushtaya, the Chatushtaya of fulfillment, realization, and it has 4 components: Shuddhi, purification, leading to Mukti, which is liberation, leading to Siddhi, which is the perfections, the 6 perfections we have seen, and ending with Bhukti, which is this divine participation. So, having dwelt now on the purification, we move to the second, which is the liberation. This entire chapter in the Synthesis of Yoga is titled Liberation of the Spirit, and it's followed by Liberation of Nature. So these are the 2 which we will be concluding our whole discussion with. Today we take only one of them, the liberation of the spirit, and we will conclude hopefully next time with the other. Sri Aurobindo is very clear about the relationship, how one leads to the other. He says purification is the condition for liberation. All purification is a release, a delivery, for it is a throwing away of limiting, binding, obscuring imperfections and confusions. And he reminds us, in summary, how purification from desire brings the freedom of the psychic prana, which allows you to fully enjoy, truly, freely enjoy. Similarly, purification of wrong emotions and troubling reactions brings you freedom of the heart and allows the full, free expression of liberated emotions without their attachments and distortions. Similarly, purification of the obscuring, limited thought of the sense mind brings the freedom of the intelligence, and the intelligence itself, sufficiently purified and liberated from mere intellectuality, opens you to the freedom of the Gnostic consciousness. Now, this was the scheme we had broadly covered. And when this liberation, which comes from the purification, takes place, it is still, he says, a liberation of the instruments. The true freedom of the soul, the mukti, is still something more essential. It is a spiritual freedom and not merely a freedom of the instrumental nature. And so this is what we're going to enter into. Just to recall the stages which we had discussed last time and their purifications. If you have practiced some of the suggestions which were made and the forms of practice suggested, every time you made those, notice how in the act of pulling out the buddhi from the sense mind and separating it, you gain tremendous clarity. Your thoughts become freer, lighter, clearer. Even you will feel purer. It's as if they are more refined. And in that state, you can turn and receive an intuition also more easily. If that same buddhi was bound in the sense mind, it is sluggish, it is heavy, it is confused, it cannot discriminate or perceive clearly. So it's as if in doing so, the clarity of perception grows, and perception as a power is liberated from confusion of the sense mind. And similarly for the sense mind in relation to the psychical prana and so on. and the senses and the layers which we discussed last time. Observe this. Every time you practice, every time you work to purify and separate, notice the sense of liberation. The act of noticing will itself amplify the effect. And then when you're aware, you feel the difference, you can simply will the difference to grow. The sense of freedom can be widened, enlarged, opened out, and then turned upward to the source of the higher freedom. This is the essential process, and it is as simple as this. Start with whatever difference you feel, don't stop with it, catch it, and then amplify, open out, widen, and then turn up. You will be surprised at the rapidity with which this movement of purification and liberation will grow within you. As you are aware, Sri Aurobindo himself made the entire trajectory to be living in the supramental consciousness and even to be initiating most of his life from that in a span of nearly 5 years. And without help, or whatever help was, only was on an inner level. We have the benefit of his help. And even if we assume that we are growing much more slowly in our capacity, this is the means by which one could speed it up so enormously. Now, the sense of liberation, mukti, is, he says, can be thought of as nirvanic extinction, a silence of the whole being, dissolution into some kind of an absolute, or absorption in some blissful state, or wideness of peace which is without action, drowning in some higher state, and so on. But he says that's one way of looking at it. For us, it will not be the way. And what will be our idea of this liberation? He says, we shall give to the idea of liberation, mukti, only the connotation of that inner change which is common to all experience of this kind, whatever list we just went through. What is common? What is essential in all? Essential to perfection and indispensable to spiritual freedom. So what is common? We shall find that it then implies always two things: a rejection and an assumption. You'll see this pattern repeatedly. There's a negative aspect and a positive aspect. So what are these? A negative and a positive side. The negative movement of freedom is a liberation from the principal bonds, the master knots of the lower soul nature. The positive side, an opening or growth into the higher spiritual existence. Now you've seen this double movement even in the training of the buddhi. As we saw, it has to stand back from the sense mind and the senses and the life energies, and at the same time it has to open to the influence of the higher. Well, something similar now taking place in the domain of the liberation. The reason I'm highlighting this is because the movement seamlessly transitions. What was the method for purification now becomes also a method for liberation. And there's a seamless transition from one to the other. So he has referred to master knots. What are these master knots? He explains that we've seen already some of the bindings which came from, for which the purification had to be done, which were the knots of instruments of mind, heart, vital energies, and dulling of the physical consciousness and so on. But behind that, deeper still, are what he calls the deeper twistings than these, which he calls instrumental knots. So what are them? What are these? We find them pointed out for us and insisted on with great force and a constant emphatic repetition in the Gita, the Bhagavad Gita, to which Sri Aurobindo gave great importance and wrote the entire volume of the essays on the Gita for a reason. Because in fact, the integral yoga has many components, even many forms, which would closely align with the practices that the Bhagavad Gita recommends, and yet it transcends greatly. And so he makes also a continuity from what has been for a very long time now, several thousand years, the basis for yogic practice in a large part of humanity. And I don't mean just India, because the seeds of those teachings have spread all over the world. So there is not only the sense of continuity, even as there is a transcendence and even a going far beyond what the Bhagavad Gita presents. But Sri Aurobindo takes pains in this chapter to use all the Sanskrit keywords of the Bhagavad Gita which correspond. And they are like link points, threads in which, even if someone were in that practice, the nature of that understanding is lifted up to a higher level, and that practice transitions seamlessly into the broader framework, the broader goals, and the greater perfection of the integral yoga. So understand the value of those Sanskrit terms, while at the same time they make very precise the meaning of certain ideas for which there's no precise English equivalent. But at the same time, they link this in the practice. And so it is very useful. Some of those terms which we will come across, I will normally not read them out now, but some of those terms you will find also have great value in various other systems and traditions of yoga or spiritual practices or even religions. For example, the three gunas is something so profound, so dealt with in such great detail in everything, including Ayurveda. And if you just think purely of your physical health, you will find the three gunas in the food and in the responses to changing environmental situations, states of body, and so on. But when Sri Aurobindo will use the three gunas, he will take it to a more essential level from which you will see how these are derived. And that will be next time. So what are the four that the Bhagavad Gita insists? They are four: desire, ego, the dualities, and the three gunas of nature. So the dualities and the three gunas of nature we will be considering in detail next time, because they represent more the aspect of liberation of nature. The first two, which is desire and ego, are the keys for the liberation of the consciousness itself, liberation of the soul. So, for to be desireless, egoless, equal of mind and soul and spirit, and nistraygunya, that is beyond the three gunas, the three modes of nature, is in the idea of the Gita to be free, mukta, liberated. And then Sri Aurobindo says something very interesting. The words are so suggestive. He says, we may accept this description, for everything essential is covered by its amplitude. Suggesting that there are perhaps other ways of describing it, but because this is reasonably complete, we will take this as a reference. Many times you will find in Sri Aurobindo's writings, he takes certain structures which are reasonably settled in the human consciousness as a starting point to build a larger and greater formulation. So far we saw the negative side of this liberation, and then he says the positive side of freedom. What does it mean? Is to be universal in soul, transcendentally one in spirit with God, possessed of the highest divine nature. As we may say, like to God, or one with Him in the law of our being. This is the whole and full sense of liberation, and this is the integral freedom of the spirit. Very suggestive again. The whole and full sense of liberation. What is the whole sense and what is the full sense? If you dwell on these two words, you'll find there's a profound insight there. I won't go into it because otherwise it will take too much time. But simply I leave you a hint. You can say, a bowl is wholly taken up and is now full. You get the sense of the difference between the two. And then dwell on this sentence and you will see what it reveals. So now we come to the two, desire and ego. And Sri Aurobindo will present them in a much more profound perspective, in which we will see their justification, we will see their true origin, as well as the means for the correction. When we wish to be desireless, that being one of the four aspects of the true freedom, it's not merely the vital desire craving that we are speaking of, but a spiritual desirelessness which has a wider and more essential meaning. So Sri Aurobindo explains that desire has a double knot, a lower knot in the prana, that is that craving which you have, and the craving in the instruments, and a very subtle knot in the soul itself. Soul here is not the psychic being, but the sense of I as an individual, with the buddhi as its first support. The Sanskrit word is pratishtha, the supporting. French equivalent is point d'appui, the point of support, of leverage. You see, that is much more suggestive. If you have a tiny rock, Archimedes said, and give me a long enough lever, I can lift the whole earth. The point of support can be tiny, but if it is solid enough, then by leverage you can lift a huge amount. And while you may say, oh, this is great strength, the earth is being lifted, actually it's the point of support, this tiny point which is your key. So our buddhi similarly is the pratishtha, the point of support for a subtler sense of the desire. And you will see there the ego connection also. And so a very subtle knot in the soul itself, with the buddhi as its first support, which is the inmost origin of this mesh of our bondage. So the desire is like a mesh that spreads out, like if you've seen a fisherman throw the mesh of the net, it spreads out wide, settles, falls, and catches all the fish. But the point from which it is thrown and the point to which it is pulled back is still the same point. And so that's our first support for this mesh of our bondage. And then the bondage spreads into the whole of your nature. Now we have to understand, where does this desire come from, and this subtler form of desire, not the coarser cravings which we have already touched upon. The true source is not there. And there are two ways of looking at it. So he's going to show us as you look from below up, and then as you look from top down. And then there's also an in-between which we will share. When we look from below, desire presents itself to us as a craving of the life force. And then he describes how it goes through the emotions, goes up through the into the aesthetic passions, dynamic part, even the rational turn of the buddhi. Everything is as if mixed with, suffused with this craving that comes in the life force, rising as if from below. And then he says, this desire is essential to the ordinary man. He cannot live or act as an individual without knotting up all his action into the service of some kind of lower or higher craving, preference, or passion. If you remove from yourself all craving, preference, or passion, whether lower or higher, doesn't matter, suddenly you'll find yourself pointless, meaningless. You'll probably slide into some kind of depression, helplessness, and just wither away. Fortunately, at that point, nature's instinct, desire, kicks in at some point and craves, pushes, if nothing else, just to survive. And so you need it. It is essential, he says, in a normal human life. And you need this because it forms as the knot which makes for the individuality. It is the coordinating thing around which your thoughts, emotions, sensations, actions, demands, planning, action, all these are woven, and this is the knot which holds them all together. So desire plays a crucial role here in the normal life, and especially emerging from the animal evolution. You see how valuable it is in the animal instinct. This is as far as seen from below. But when we are able to look at desire from above, that means all the way from the top, remember the deeper spiritual psychology, we see that what supports this instrumental desire is a will of the spirit. So there's a will of the spirit from above, which is actually supporting this, even creating it in a way. There is a will, tapas shakti, concentrated energy, by which the secret spirit imposes on its outer members all their action. It imposes all their action and draws from it an active delight of its being, an ananda, in which they very obscurely and imperfectly, if at all consciously, partake. So there's an imposition from above of the will, and there is also above a delight taken through all these experiences, and these very indirectly at best may participate in that delight, but that's about it. This tapas is the will of the transcendent spirit who creates the universal movement. You see, it goes all the way to the origin of the whole creation. The consciousness transcending space, transcending time, transcending conditions, transcending all limitations and forms, containing all possibility, potential, and transcending even all those. That when it turns to manifest its potentiality, to manifest in universality of infinite possibilities and their play, as it chooses to pour out these, that impulse is your origin. That's a pure divine will coming from a great freedom and bliss with no conditioning, no limitations of any kind. So, this tapas is the will of the transcendent spirit who creates the universal movement. Then next, of the universal spirit who supports and informs it. So, from the transcendence in the universal movement is the universal consciousness, which supports this will and informs it, fills this will in everything, down to each atom, filling each galaxy to fulfill its purpose and filling each atom to fulfill its purpose, and naturally each cell which evolves from the atoms and each creature which grows out of those cells, and in each one of us. It informs, fills in, and supports. And that this is at the level of the universal consciousness, universal spirit. And then of the free individual spirit who is the sole center of its multiplicities. So that same will now continues into the free individual spirit at the very core of us, in the self which presides over our individual growth and supporting from within as the psychic presence, where there's also psychic will to delight. And that will is all the way one single will on these three levels. And it is one single. And therefore, you can see the single will that acts within you, traced back to its origin, is also the will that acts within another when traced to the origin, and within another and another and another. And therefore, you see, at least in the universal play, all these different, as if focal points of individual will down to the level of atoms, are perfectly coordinated, always in a balance, always in a harmony of the play. Not necessarily reflecting or expressing the bliss of the Satchidananda, nevertheless, capturing the harmony at least, because the play in these forms is reasonably automatic. In the individualized consciousness awakening, while there is the automatism in the animal life, as it wakes up, it breaks out of the automatism and then starts a very interesting problem, as we will see. So, it is one will, free in all these at once, comprehensive, including everything, harmonious, perfectly in alignment with everything else, unified. That is, all the fragments in appearance to us, at least, are really all in one movement. They are not pieces. We find it when we live and act in the spirit. So if we can step back from the mind, from the limited frontal personality instruments and enter the consciousness of spirit, here it is. This is the purpose for which I was born, for which I emerged from the oneness to take on an individualized experience, and then took birth in human body. We find it when we live and act in the spirit. What do we find it to be? To be an effortless and desireless, a spontaneous and illumined, a self-fulfilling and self-possessing, a satisfied and blissful will of the spiritual delight of being. So I wanted to read this text. It was essential because of what it captures, you can see. And it's important to dwell on each of these words. When it acts from the spirit and when we find it within us, always its action is effortless because it is the same will in all things. It is desireless because it craves nothing, it has everything. It is already everything, including what it chooses to become. It already is. So no craving. When it acts, it does not hesitate. It does not have to face contradictions and mixed parts of itself struggling against itself. So it is flowing, spontaneous. fully aware of what it is doing, why it is doing, where it is going, and therefore illumined, utterly conscious, self-fulfilling. As it acts out, whatever it chooses to be becomes inevitably. Even what comes to oppose is, after all, its own action through another form, through another individuality, and therefore included in its action, and therefore fulfills itself inevitably, even though opposition is as if a means for its fulfillment. And self-possessing. At each time, it is entirely itself, never losing itself into something else or becoming conditioned or limited by anything else, because all is an expression of itself. And as a result, also satisfied and blissful will. There is nothing it lacks. Even as it fulfills itself, it is the joy of fulfilling, not from any lack. And so the blissfulness is always inherent. Satisfied and blissful will of the spiritual delight of being, which was the original cause for this manifestation, which is the original cause why we individualized and took birth and entered this play. Spiritual delight of being. And this is felt, found most directly in the individualized center, which is the psychic being, or leaning back in the support of the psychic being, we find the self, and the individualized self, what Sri Aurobindo calls the central being, and in it we find that. And the whole journey of our development, of our purposes, it's all held in this. In the central self, whose center is described above the head, there's nothing to change. All potential is held. In the psychic being, which is its projection, emanation, entering form, and the space-time growth, evolution, of course you have growth, change, and evolution. But all its potential is held always in this central being. I'm pointing this out. It's not directly in the discussion of Sri Aurobindo because it'll help us to understand. There's a letter of Sri Aurobindo where he describes how when the central being above pulls together the personality, all the disparate pieces, the layers, the parts, etc., they all are pulled together and a more cohesive individuality is formed. If the central being does not pull, if it lets go, these pieces tend to fall apart. In physics, we have this word for the entropy, increasing chaos, increasing dispersal. And the reverse of it is negative entropy, which is the gathering of order spontaneously out of chaos, which we see only in life. We do not see it in physics. We do not see it in matter. Everywhere there's a tendency to spread out and to disperse. Why? Because that's the nature of matter. What makes life possible is this power that brings it all together and pulls out harmony out of chaos. That is life force at its lowest level, but all the way up to the divine will. This presiding consciousness of your self, the individualized aspect of the self, the central being, presiding over as if holds all this together. In the beginning, it may simply hold a general influence. Occasionally, when necessary, it tightens the influence. And suddenly the whole personality draws together like the threads. The analogy would be if you see a puppet and you leave all the threads loose, the puppet falls and each piece is somehow fallen apart. One thread going through, joining them, but loose. You pull the thread, the puppeteer pulls the thread, and straight away the puppet comes up, stands straight, and becomes an individual. It is as distinct as this. Why would it not do that all the time? Maybe it delights in this experience, chooses, okay, now I've played enough with disparate tendencies, let's tighten and bring some focus. It wills it and the whole personality pulls up. You will see sometimes people who seem to be lost, who have such contradictions within themselves. They are as if fragmented even as a personality, and in extreme cases that becomes a psychiatric problem. Sometimes with a biological basis, but still, when that happens, if the self says enough and pulls, well, things fall into place. Or if the individual within says, that's not how I want to live, it makes an effort to open to the influence of the divine presence, the self, or the psychic being within. And as it opens, automatically all your pieces fall into place and form a natural harmony, a cohesiveness. Whenever the psychic influence comes forward, a similar thing happens. All the pieces as if tend to turn and fall in right relation with each other. When that influence is covered up or withdrawn, the desire impulses and other impulses and pieces begin to fragment and fall apart. So you see now desire as seen from below, and it seems something quite negative, binding, compelling, limiting. And you see desire as seen from above, and you see it is the very purpose in the divine manifestation. But that is not desire, or you could call it desire. But Sri Aurobindo warns it's better not to mix terms, because that is not really desire. It does not crave, it does not need. It is always complete, as we've seen. So it is a delight, spiritual delight of being and a delight of becoming, which then, as it flows down, infuses into all these instrumental parts, and as a result, awakes in them or causes in them the sense of a will to be, to become, to do, to act, which takes this form of desire. In another discussion, you will find this in the Life Divine also, and in his commentary on the Isha Upanishad, Sri Aurobindo points out that over here in our origin, where we are one with the divine consciousness as Lord, we own everything because the whole universe is ourselves, isn't it? This is our home, this is our play, everything is yours. You are king, emperor. But here in the individualized, fragmented, limited ego consciousness, I am only this much, I have only this much, all the rest is not me and not mine. The gap between the true oneness and ownership and this fake limitation, the gap in between is desire. Or the desire is what attempts to fill and bridge that gap by expanding so that I may own more, I may own all, I may possess all and be one with all. It's a reminder of that, the forgotten memory of our true lordship and our true ownership, possession and enjoyment of the whole creation in the oneness. Remembered, but remembered in a way that's forgotten and so distorted, gives rise to desire to fill that gap. So these are three different ways in which you can recognize the sense of desire. But now what happens? Let's say, seen from above, there is this universal, transcendent will, universal will, and leaning, filling everything. What happens? Where do we lose it? But the moment the individual soul leans away from the universal and transcendent truth of its being, leans towards ego, tries to make this will a thing of itself, a separate personal energy, that will changes its character. This is our critical point of transition. There is this divine will, our origin, transcendent, universal, individual, smooth in a continuum. But now the sense of me, soul, can be aware of that or can lean towards this. Oh, what's it like to feel separate, to feel limited, to feel bound, and it leans more and more into this. And as it leans more into this, becomes the sense of separation of energy, my will, my energy, and it becomes a thing of its own. I have initiated it, not that I, but this separate I. And at that point, suddenly you find there is an impulse, but not the origin, a fragment, a piece. With reference to what? With reference to other pieces that it sees. And therefore now you have pieces entering in conflict, in clash, in disorder and chaos. And yet it represents still something of that originating will. That's what I described in the third example of the desire sense wanting to bridge. I need to find my fullness. How do I do that? That impulse is still secret inside this fragmented will. And so it's trying, where is it? Where is, how do I find, how do I grow, how do I expand, and so on. So the moment it has got this separate character, it becomes different. What does it become? It becomes an effort, where earlier it was streaming because all is itself, no conflict, no contradiction. Now it is a fragment, all is different and separate. And even all is against me because it is doing what it wants, not what I want. Immediately, it becomes an effort, a straining, a heat of force, which may have its fiery joys of effectuation and possession. So now in my heat of force, I managed, oh, I got it, oh. So there's a joy, intensity, but you're exhausted with that. But it has also its afflicting recoils and pain of labor. I've struggled for 20 years, and after 20 years again, I failed. I give up. Enough. I can't bear it. This life is too much. This world is so horrible. And all the recoils which come. So afflicting recoils, pain of labor is the other side. Fiery joys of effectuation, fiery joys of possession. And you have this duality which forms. Because you're dealing with pieces, finite pieces, meeting finite pieces. It is this that turns in each instrument into an intellectual, emotional, dynamic, sensational, or vital will of desire, wish, craving. This is what we experience. This is all we know. Recognize that behind all that is still that true will, but we have lost the link. This is a fragment. Even when the instruments per se are purified of their own apparent initiative and particular kind of desire, this imperfect tapas may still remain. And so long as it conceals the source or deforms the type of the inner action, the soul has not the bliss of liberty, or can only have it by refraining from all action. Now I find the moment I act, I have this fragmented will which has all these problems. I stop action. And in that I can lean back into some greater joy, delight, peace, harmony, and so on. But the moment I engage with action, I tend to lose. Or you find the source, you have it, but the source concealed, you don't have it. All these problems come. And then, if you remain quiet, it seems to be fine. If allowed to persist, it will rekindle the pranic or other desires. And this is the problem, he says, it keeps coming back again and again because the seed is still distorted. The seed of our desire, the spiritual seed or beginning of desire too must be expelled, renounced, cast away. The sadhaka must either choose an active peace and complete inner silence or lose individual initiation in a unity with the universal will, the tapas of the divine Shakti. So you see now the key. You have to be able to bring complete stillness, but also open out to that, which is the source, the true will, and allow its initiation, for which any mixture of your own separate will tend to distort or mix or break. So complete stillness and then opening to the source and only what thy will is. So there are again here two ways to do it, passive and active. The passive way is you become completely immobile, you remove all personal effort, no wish, no expectation, no particular impulse to action. Now you'll see the equality gives you a base for this shift, but still here you're letting go of all sense of action. Then you're passive. Something may happen, it may not. It'll happen in spite of yourself. You'll say, God willed it. If it doesn't happen, you say, God willed it. Not very useful, but it's a passive and maybe a preparatory stage at best. The active way is to be thus immobile and impersonal in the mind, but to allow the supreme will in its spiritual purity to act through the purified instruments. So you have to first purify your instruments, which has been the discussion so far. But then you have to allow the divine will to act in its spiritual purity, not in its distortion or clouding as it enters you. So your purity is necessary base, and then its spiritual purity can act And you will still be immobile and impersonal in the mind, but it will initiate. Now, if you recall, earlier we have discussed the training for developing the intuition. This was one of the practices you will remember. In fact, it's the second practice. By becoming quiet, shifting the center. So the first practice was complete stillness and silence at will, as long as you can. The second was shifting the center of your consciousness as deep as you can, as close as you can to the psychic, if you could, but as close as you can. And then from there, opening out to wait for the divine initiation, for the divine will to initiate, and then allowing it to flow through you. And you see, it's exactly the same thing which is being described, but here in a more broad objective. But you see, if this base has been set, then the development of the intuition almost becomes inevitable. It's fascinating to observe how the way Sri Aurobindo formulates all these different objectives and the form of the practice, when you go to the essence, the key of each of these knots, the form of the practice actually aligns and becomes one common or a few common elements. But if you're conscious of all these different aspects, you can consciously participate. If you just focused on the intuitive development, missing out this aspect, that you can actually become free of personal desire and even eventually free of the ego by this practice, which at the same time opens you to the higher divine will and even the higher consciousness, and opening to the intuitive, and then from there the supramental consciousness. The practice is the same. The various aspects of the practice now come into your awareness, and so it can become a multifaceted single movement in the practice. Then, if the soul lives still at the level of the mental consciousness, it becomes an instrument. That acts, and I am the instrument. Servant of God, perhaps instrument of God. But if it rises through the intuitive process, more and more opening to the supramental, which is the originating power of that will, then it becomes an instrument and a participant, because here you are equally participating in the initiation of the will, even as this rest of you becomes the instrument. Now you're instrument and participant. And what participant in the bliss of the divine action and the bliss of the divine Ananda. And in that consciousness, both your individual consciousness and your nature through which things flow out, the instruments through which you're acting, are unified. Soul and nature unite in that. Come down to the mind, soul and nature separate. You become an instrument, and to the extent you're purified, it acts more smoothly or not. To the extent your nature is purified, the action is to that effect, to that extent, complete or more effective without the reactions. Now you saw the key word here was the soul leaning towards ego, which brought us to this, broke away from the stream of the divine will. The same soul can lean back to the divine consciousness. It can lean towards ego or lean back from the ego. Watch this movement. Observe how you can actually shift in your own consciousness and play with this movement. And there you'll find a key. The key which will help you to break free from this personal initiation and to be able to open out to the true divine initiation. Lean forward into ego, lean back into wider, freer, deeper, diviner presence, self, divine mother's consciousness, love for the divine mother, opening to her, inviting her energy to fill and flow and initiate the action. You see, that's one form it can take very naturally. So this turn to ego, narrowing, separating, cutting off, the ego turn, the separative turn of the being is the fulcrum. Fulcrum is the center around which everything moves. The wheel turns, the axis. Turn to ego, the separative turn of being, the sense of separation which cuts off. You can be individualized without being separate. But in the initial movement, one of the aspects of the delight was also the delight of self-loss. And the soul said, well, let me explore this. And then there's the greater delight of rediscovering yourself and uniting with the divine. So Mother puts it in these terms. She says, the reason this universe was created, she says, because there is a bliss of oneness, but there is a bliss of union. You can be in the oneness with the divine, and yes, it is blissful. Or you can experience separateness and then approach the oneness in a bliss of union with the divine. And she says that bliss is far more complete, far more rich. And then she says, in a way, it is for this that the whole universe was created. Think about it. It's a profound insight. And in the discussion we're having now, you see how it completes this idea. There was the necessity for the delight to experience what it's like to lose oneself. And then, of course, inevitably the return to rediscover oneself. But also in the process, the delight has been that much multiplied in the eventual bliss of union. Think about it. We chose this. We chose to enter this play. And now we have chosen to awaken. We have chosen to recover ourselves. We have chosen to unite in the bliss of union and then participate now with an individualized focal point. No more ego fragmented, no more ego separated, but unified with ourselves, our own source. But we went through that experience to prepare as if a vehicle, an individual focal point into which this could happen. It could have been done otherwise also. We could have grown like this, flowed to form an individual, always united with the divine will. And Sri Aurobindo gives this analogy like a flower opening petal by petal, always in perfect harmony. The whole universe could have flowered out. No conflict, no chaos, no collision, no ignorance. Could have. He says, but that would be a limited creation. The freedom of the divine consciousness is an utter freedom, including freedom to be not itself, the freedom to oppose itself, the freedom to collide, to play with chaos, to lose itself, and then rediscover. That utter freedom, if it had to be manifested in a complete universe, then the possibility to break away, the possibility of conflict, collision, chaos, self-loss, and self-recovery, all that had to be manifested. That's the universe we are in. Or rather, that's the universe we chose to manifest in for the sake of the most complete, most adventurous, most challenging, but also most rich creation. That other flower-like universe would have been perfect always, but would not have so many possibilities available to it because it would always be limited within its perfection. This is breaking out of all limits of any conceived perfection, and therefore can create a perfection more complete, more beautiful. So I'm digressing from our discussion, but this helps to complete our understanding of things. And so he comes to this sense of ego. Now, discussing the cause of desire, we found the root cause of the desire was this turn of the soul leaning into separative sense. And he says the seat of ego tends to be found to be in the buddhi, but as we saw, it is only a fulcrum, a point of support. And in us, at least, he says, it is the ego idea which chiefly supports the falsehood of a separative existence. You wake up every morning from a sleep where you have forgotten, you're lost in unconsciousness of some kind. You wake up to the sense of I. You were lost in a kind of a not I, therefore forgetfulness, and you wake up to assemble into a focal point of I. Of course, that was never lost. That mental I was subsumed by some other kind of I, but still. You wake up into this, and then you look at the universe as I am center of the universe. Value everything in terms of, is it going to help me? Is it going to oppose me? Or is it neutral? Neutral I can ignore. Oppositions I will fear. Helps I will crave and desire. That's it. So to get rid of this idea, to dwell on the opposite idea of unity, of the one self, the one spirit, the one being of nature is therefore an effective remedy. So this is going to be one of our practices. All your life you spend in dwelling on the sense of separateness. How much time did you spend in the sense of oneness? Interesting. By itself, it never happens. We are so fixated in the programming and the conviction that we are separate. So occasionally you're sitting alone, no particular purpose, suddenly the sense of oneness comes on you. It had to leak out from the hidden reality where it is already there. It had to leak out through a crack in your personality to catch you unaware to give you that. Even if it came at some other time when you were busy, let's say watching a movie, chatting with friends, doing your job, doing your business, worrying about your life, you are lost in the movie. So even if it comes forward, you won't notice it came. But right now you are sitting alone in nature, or you're on your balcony or in your room and thinking, oh, I have nothing to do. What shall I do? And because momentarily your mind was quiet, it could leak through, and suddenly a deep sense of calm, peace, or a sense of oneness, or a sense of loss of separateness, at least, dawns on you. It's like a light which was hidden behind the darkness. Now it comes out. And then there are two reactions possible. What's happening to me? Oh my God, I might have blood pressure or something. My head is a bit giddy. You shake it out and get back to your life. Or you say, oh, this feels so good. I wish I could be like this more often. And then you notice every time you sat alone, looking out from a balcony, from a window, or in a garden, or in nature, or on a mountaintop, feels like this. It feels good. I feel from the mountaintop the sense of vastness, oneness, freedom. Boundaries seem as if to fade away, melt away. For a while, I feel good. Then something inside restlessly pulls. I must get back to my work. I have to do that. And you lean back into your ego consciousness. Notice the leaning movement in reversed now, leaning back into your freedom. If you catch this movement and practice this, what you got in the mountain, what you got in the forest or on the beach, or in your special moment of dawning of oneness, you can get at will wherever you are in any condition. So you're sitting in a place, in your workplace, let's say, where normally you would be fully engaged and self-lost in a hypnosis of the drama. You say, oh, it's a moment of break. Take a deep breath, lean back. Oh, this feels good. This feels free. And then from a freer poise, you can re-engage. And something of that freedom now fills. And you go back and forth every chance you get. Practice this. It's not difficult. But then consciously also dwell on this idea now. Cultivate, dwell on the idea of unity. To dwell on the opposite idea of unity, all this is one universe. Everything within is formed of the one substance, one energy, one consciousness. Even very physically, you can look at physically the whole thing and say, every single atom is formed of one ocean of energy. Every electron of every atom is bouncing around, jumping from atom to atom, whirling around, maybe coming back to the same atom and whirling, and they're all flowing in one huge mass of energy. The only thing which makes for the appearance is the repeat of the flow. The electron comes, flows into this atom, goes to the next, flows into it, goes to the next, flows. Meanwhile, another electron has taken its place, flows, jumps to the next, another comes. The flow is repeated. The whirl, like a whirlpool, is repeated, which makes for the appearance of stable forms. Actually, there is nothing like a stable form. Everything is a whirl. Dwell on this idea, imprint it in your sight, in your thought, in the mind, through the buddhi. Purified buddhi, it's easier and it holds longer. It stays, deepens much more easily. Because it's free of the sense mind, which would suddenly tell you, no, but this is different, this is different, this is different. You rise out and, yes, I can see the oneness. I can feel, at least in my thought, the oneness. And then I lean into it with my other parts, other layers. From the buddhi, it transmits, and the heart opens, and the physical senses open, the life force opens, and I realize, I feel this continuum of life energy flowing through me, flowing through everything, through everyone. And it's the same energy whirling within me before flowing into the next. Isn't it? Think about your body biologically. What is it made of? The food that you eat, which you take in, absorbed into your bloodstream. Meanwhile, it replaces some cells which are thrown out as they have finished their use, and those are excreted eventually. So basically, your physical body is food coming in from the universe, flowing round and round, and then eventually being thrown out. As long as the flow round and round is maintaining broadly the same shape, you say, oh, I am me. I look in the mirror, I say, ah, yes, I am the same person. The same happens at the life energies from the universe. The same happens with your thoughts and mental substance. And much more truly, the whole is held in oneness of the totality of the spiritual, creative consciousness and energy. So you dwell on this idea of unity, idea of one self. All this is finally one energy of one consciousness, which is the one self. That is the only reality. All else is waves and ripples and whirls in the ocean of self. One spirit, leaning back, free of not only the worlds, free of not only the flow of time, free of not only the limitations of space and forms. It is one indescribable spirit, or one being of nature. All of nature is this whirling energy which forms all this. Behind it, so now objectivizing outside you, all nature, all forms, all objects, behind them is one spirit, one being of nature. It's as if the whole universe is one being who takes on this form of universe and of nature. And so to dwell on all these, he says, is therefore an effective remedy. To do what? To reverse this ego idea. But you have to give it time. Or very slowly, a few fragments, a few moments in your life. That's all you have. If you wait for it to happen spontaneously. When it does happen, catch it. Extend it as much as possible, consciously. Try to extend it into your routine of life. But by habituating, you'll find you can recover it at will, more and more easily, more and more deeply eventually. And whatever is given to you as a first experience, or whatever you attain by this leaning back, you'll find you can take more, deeper, wider, freer, higher, opening out all the way into this inner and higher consciousness. Recall the description of the three intuitions which were there in the purification of the mind and the intellect. I think 3 sessions ago. And it's the same practice now, but with a different orientation, with a different priority in a sense. And then he says it's not entirely possible to cast out the ego idea, or it's not entirely effective, because until you have purified all the instruments, because somewhere in these other layers, that sense is there. At the very least, your body says, I, me, and my survival, protection, which is what stays even in sleep. You are unconscious, but some noise happens, your body pulls your consciousness back and makes you wake up. Watch out, there's danger. Someone's calling. So each of these layers has its own sense of the habit of the separative consciousness, and they fill your buddhi and bring it back to old patterns. So there's an obstinacy or a passion of persistence in the normal action of the sense, mind, and prana and body. So he says you can't throw out this ego idea entirely unless you've also purified. So you see how the purification was an important base to bring us to this practice of the liberation. If you have worked on that, then he says you have the sense of oneness, and the spiritual sense of oneness can be held in a firm foundation. But this is the means by which you will open to it. You can do this when you're sitting. You can do it when you're walking, when you're even driving, or if you're being driven, you're in some public transport, easier at that point. You can look at everyone around. You can look at what is outside the window, or you can simply dwell on the sense of the whole universe as one and go through similar exercise. It does not need effort. It does not need strenuous concentration. It's almost like an effortless awareness, and turn in your awareness. That's all. If you were to try to remove the active sense of ego and say, that's how I will get free of ego, he says that also does not work. It only brings you into a state of inactive, inert quietude of separate being. You see, very often in ascetic traditions, you'll find somebody praised. Oh, that fellow, he's so selfless. He serves everybody. He never questions. He never counters. He never rebels. He just accepts whatever is given. Yes, superficially, it looks like there's no ego or the ego has thinned enough. But if you looked inside the person and felt, the person says, I am so selfless. I serve everybody. I am doing everything correct. I am so wonderful. You have a passive, inert kind of ego. And it can be very quiet, very even tamasic or sattvic, and the two sometimes tend to blend into each other. So the person has no personal initiation of any obvious kind, but his initiation is to live up to his standard of what it is to be egoless. There's the example given of the disciple who approaches the master and says, Master, I want to be your most humble disciple. And the master says, even in humility, you want to be the most superior, most humble, you see. So the ego has ways of popping up in various ways. And the key is not to fight the ego or to bring it into quietude. At best, quietude is a step towards its thinning out. But he says the sense of ego has to be replaced. And what is the sense of ego? The sense of being separate. I and not I. As long as there is a not I, you have the ego sense. It can be in thought, it can be in senses also, but it's ego separative sense. So this ego sense must be replaced by a oneness. And so it can open out, of course, to the universal, but that's not enough. It must go all the way to the transcendent, that which is beyond space and time, that oneness. So the ego sense must be replaced by a oneness with the transcendental divine and with universal being. The movement of leaning back, opening out, would be an opening to the universal, and then opening above into that which transcends would complete it. At that point, you have an individuality still, but which is truly universal and truly free. So Sri Aurobindo goes in some detail, and I won't enter that too much now for lack of time, but he explains how when this consciousness is so opened out and the sense of the oneness begins to fill more and more, you can enter in relation with the divine, not only in the transcendence, but in all things. That relationship tends to deepen. The individual then enjoys in the spirit, in the bliss of the spirit, his oneness with universal existence, his oneness with the timeless divine, and his oneness with all other beings. And that is the essential sense of a spiritual liberation from the ego. That's the aim. That's the mukti that we are referring to. And that means you don't have to withdraw. You don't have to disengage. You're still participating, but it is the divine will because of your oneness with the divine, but participating now in the blissfulness of the play as the divine participates or enjoys that blissful play, which we lost. Now comes the possibility from that poise which you have gained, let's say, however partially. But the moment the soul leans towards mental limitation, there is a certain sense of spiritual separativeness, which has its joys, but may at any moment lapse into the entire ego sense, ignorance, oblivion of oneness. It's a bit like what you experience if you ever had a lucid dream. You're conscious in your dream. Oh, I'm conscious in my dream. I don't want to wake up, but the memory of the body, shoop, you get pulled back and you wake up. And so the skill is in that conscious state, you say, I'm not going to think of the body, I'm going to think of this and stay in this. And it's a precarious skill to maintain. because it's so easy to lapse back. And something similar happens. If you try to lean into the sense of mind and mind separation, from there you get sucked very quickly into this ego sense, and it binds you and you lose the poise. But that moment of separateness in the mental consciousness can have its joy also, which is one of the things we should enjoy. But that, and at any moment, lapse into the entire ego sense, because that is such a strong habit. Often what happens also, we have a spiritual experience of some kind. We are in a flatus or a state of deeper, higher, wider consciousness, oneness. We go to sleep at night, you wake up and it's all gone. Because that's when you identified, you came out of the identification with ego sense, oops, where did it go? You can dwell on the memory, and that's how bit by bit you will get back. So how do you get to that freedom in a permanence? So he says to get rid of this separateness, well, normally you tend to absorb yourself in the divine, idea of the divine. You try to abolish the sense of individual and the sense of separateness. And in certain very intense ascetic forms, it takes these various forms of trance immersion and so on, or absorption in the dwelling, but not in this world. You dwell in that world, so to say, or you just want to be in his presence, nothing else matters. So there's an exclusive focus. And there are various names to these three kinds of relationships, which I don't go into. You can read on your own. But the point is not that for us. I'll read again. The way proposed for the integral yoga is a lifting up and surrender of the whole being to him, by which not only we become one with him in our spiritual existence, but dwell too in him and he in us, so that the whole nature is full of his presence and changed into the divine nature. We become one spirit and consciousness and life and substance with the divine. So there is this, through the surrender and the lifting up of the whole being, not just one part of the consciousness, you dwell in him, you are one with him in the spiritual existence, but you dwell with him also as an immersion. You are separate but immersed in him. And at the same time, we live and move in and have a various joy of that oneness. You still have the multiplicity of relation. All these three kinds of relationships are simultaneously present. Total identification, dwelling in immersion, and then having relationships as two separate as if, but not truly separate, because you have that oneness. This integral liberation from the ego into the divine spirit and nature can only be relatively complete on our present level, that is, as in mind. It begins to become absolute as we open to and mount into the gnosis. This is the liberated perfection. So we're very clear now of what the definition of this liberation is. And whatever we may attain, as long as we are in a mind consciousness which is separative in its very character, or limiting in its very character, it's a relative, let's say, immersion. As the consciousness then opens out to the intuitive, and through the intuitive to a higher grade of oneness, which is approaching the Gnostic, it becomes more perfect. And that's fine. We start with where we are. This itself is so joyous that its further development and perfection will be only a continuation and a growth even in greater and greater joy. So now we come to these two things. We had the question of desire and then the question of the ego. And we saw the relationship between the two. The ego sense, or rather soul leaning into separative sense of ego, makes for the desire which breaks away from the divine will. You want to relink that? Well, your consciousness has to lean back to the oneness. And now the desire itself dissolves and is replaced by the pure continuity of the divine will. So the liberation from ego, the liberation from desire, together found the central spiritual freedom. The reverse of this now he dwells on. The moment you say, I am a separate being in this universe, which is not I, my consciousness, my will, force of action, my sense of joy are all in this limited, cut off consciousness, separate from the not I. He says this forcing the consciousness into this mold is at the root of all suffering, ignorance, and evil. What follows is a detailed description where he shows how the limitation of your consciousness produces a wrong response. With it comes the contrary, perverse forms of delight of existence, loss of unity, loss of harmony. You're always in conflict with everything else, which is not self. You cannot possess the universe, you cannot enjoy the universal life, and so on. And the only thing you can do is painfully struggle to preserve and increase your littleness. And yet the deepest urge within you is to possess and enjoy the whole universe. And that brings in the frustration. And this is our condition in normal life. The only real satisfaction you can get in this fragmented condition, which is also very interesting, he points to, is the sense of growth, because from that piece separate, you can grow. That gives you satisfaction. Second satisfaction is increasing return towards itself. So in the growth in external form, of course, you have satisfaction or capacity, but growth in consciousness where you come closer to the self, this feels better. I feel so much more at ease, at peace, joyous, etc. Or growth in some harmony, internally as well as externally. Or some successful creation or realization of a potentiality within you that you're able to actualize. These are the only real satisfactions which exist in this ego fragmented, otherwise suffering consciousness and life. But also there are complexities which come because you are now made of pieces, you are at conflict with each other, and so on. You've lost the secret of harmony, which was the oneness behind, which held it all in itself. So this oneness, to be one with the divine consciousness, is the secret of a right and divine existence. And so this is as far as we will take in this part of the discussion. The point being, only in the spiritual self can we possess the true unity. For there the individual enlarges to his own total being and finds himself one with the universal existence and the transcending divinity. This is our reference now for the growth. Take this at a very practical level. Start with some time spent every day on the dwelling of the sense of oneness. I've given examples before. Notice the shift it creates within you. Notice also the shift when you lose it as you re-engage. Observe this shift and then make the shift consciously. Move it back and forth. And with it, a skill will develop that you can at any point engage in the work, lose yourself, and then shift back and recover something of the sense of the underlying oneness, even though mental. But through that mental gateway of the sense of oneness, it deepens. You begin to feel after a while behind it as if something more real, more vivid, deep, tangible, real, dense, concrete, which fills your initial mental sense of oneness. And then you can lean back into that as a communion. I feel that presence around. I feel that presence as my backdrop, even as it is backdrop of all things. And then as you lean deeper into it, I feel that presence as immersed in me or I immersed in it. And then you open out to its source. And that's how the journey takes place. You'll be surprised at how rapidly this can take place. Sri Aurobindo describes how when he was practicing this in the Alipur jail, initially with the mind imprinting the sense of oneness or the divine presence in all things. And then very quickly, in a few days, it began to be filled with that presence. And then from his mind, of course, there was the sense of perception of oneness. From the heart, a sense of love poured out to the divine presence, the divine mother, the Lord, filling everything. And then within you equally, and the love pours out. And then the things you do are increasingly felt as being done as an offering, as a sacred service to the Lord, and a willing, joyous sense of self-giving, and so on. These begin to flow. So notice these tendencies if they begin to form, and then encourage, allow them to flow, participate in them more and more. This must deepen, not just in a general sense, but also into the idea that within each person, it is the same one divine presence. The same one that is within me is within them. And so in your interactions with them, even with someone who you consider your enemy, you will feel somehow different. You don't have anymore the sense of dislike or hatred. If you have a conflict, it is, oh, what a pity. But no personal sense of reaction. And your relationships change with things, with nature, with people, with yourself. In deepening of the presence begins to take place. In this, your sense of I as a separate thing coming for a separate experience begins to thin out. And that's the right way for the ego thinning to take place. And if at that point, by then you have also turned to the sense of the presence within you, the source of your deepest aspiration, the psychic presence, its influence begins to come forward as if, becomes more vivid, more intense, fills. And a kind of a quiet joy, a kind of a quiet delight, not emotional at all, begins to fill everything. It can fill your thoughts, it can fill your emotions, it can fill your actions, it can fill your sensations. And you notice, you observe, and you allow it. And don't worry if you lose it. You'll find occasionally you are so concentrated on something that you lose this thread of continuity. You snap back into the old habit, but what is gained is never lost. You come back and you're building a bridge in losing and recovering. Until at some point, the continuity will be such that you can never lose it. It's like when you're playing a video game, you can convince yourself that you're this character with these limitations, but at some point, inevitably, you step back from that identification and you know you're free to start the game, to change the game, to switch off the game. You are free. And this sense of the underlying oneness will be like this. I am open to the divine presence, or the sense of an underlying oneness. Even if I lose it, I know that is never gone. Sri Aurobindo describes in detail how this limiting of consciousness limits knowledge, distorts knowledge, causes you to fail. The same limiting of force in the ego sense makes for wrong action, wrong will, frustration, and so on. And with it, the sense of sin and the separation of the will, which causes the sin, and so on. It's a very interesting discussion, but I don't think we have time for that. And finally, in this separation is the loss of delight. And in the limitation of delight, we have the insecurity of the world, and the joy and sorrow and pleasure and pain with which we grapple. Yet all the time, I read now, yet all the time the spiritual and universal Ananda is within, in the self, in the spirit, in its secret unity with God and existence. To cast away the chain of ego and go back to free self, immortal spiritual being, is the soul's return to its own eternal divinity. Key point, this is always there. It's never lost. You can even say, a part of me is always living in that bliss. A part of me is the self. Now think of it this way. Whatever I feel I am, a part of me is self. Can I turn to become conscious of the part of me that is self, the part of me that opens to this bliss, the part of me that knows the delight, the Ananda? You turn towards that as if, towards yourself, but like an edge, an extreme point, felt perhaps deep within or wide or somehow. Don't worry about the form. It's yourself and the part in you which opens out, and lean into that more and more. Rest in it, immerse in it. It's a form of meditation. It can be done with eyes closed. If you want to deepen in intensity, it happens naturally, your eyes closed. Or you do it with eyes open. Or you do it, you hold a poise and then extend it into work. Or whatever form you feel, the dwelling and the immersion in this, knowing that all the time the spiritual and universal Ananda is within you. Forget technical words. Forget the thought structures and the teachings and vocabulary given. Focus only on the sense of experience. Whatever I am, there's a part of me that is one with that. And I lean into that. That's all. It's pure turn of awareness. And this is the direct method, the most direct, the most rapid, to enter first in a brief contact, a touch. And once you have that, all the rest is inevitable. It is that original wrong tapas or distortion of that original divine tapas taking a wrong form of separative sense, which brought us into the ego limiting consciousness and the desire consciousness. To turn from this original desire is therefore essential. To get back to the will without desire, whose whole enjoyment of being and whole will of being is that of a free, universal and unifying Ananda. These two things are one. Now, this is a profound insight with which Sri Aurobindo closes the chapter. These two things are one. Liberation from the will that is of the nature of desire, and liberation from the ego. They are one, the same thing. I'm going to repeat this. This is so important. Because it was leaning into that sense of separateness which led to the loss of the will and the fragmentation which became the distortion that is desire. He says the two things are one. To liberate from the will that is of the nature of desire, by stepping back, leaning back to the true sense of the divine will within you, is the same as liberating from the ego sense. You work on liberating from the ego sense, you will get back the original divine will and the will to delight. You work on opening to the divine will to delight, and you'll find yourself freeing from the ego sense. They are one and the same. And the conclusion is, the oneness which is brought about by the happy loss of will, of desire and ego is the essence of mukti. It is this oneness which is the liberation that we seek. This liberation is not separate from life. It involves full participation and engagement with life, but the oneness is recovered now, and the divine delight and the divine will to delight are what lead our participation in the play. That is this beautiful divine universe. So we can dwell on this idea, on this theme, and hold the profound insights which Sri Aurobindo awakens in us, and the conviction in the insight of the experience, which is itself your point of contact with the experience. That's the Shraddha, the faith. You know it is there. You're already one with it in the tip of your consciousness. Catch that. And that's the beginning of the full experience. We can dwell on this for a few moments, and later I will suggest for you to reread on your own the chapter. Namaste.
Thank you very much for such a beautiful class. Namaste.
Thank you. And thank you, all of you who are participating in this. It is a yajna, and we enjoy it. And together, in a sense, all of us are united in this aspiration. Wherever we may be in the world, separated in space and in time, including those who watch 10 years from now, it is still the same one divine consciousness in which we live. And that is the underlying oneness that holds us together. And each one of us making an effort shares in the others, assists the others, and together we grow as one awakening in this larger divine play. That is all.